I titled my talk Ember, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Framework. It was actually kind of one of a raffle of different suggested titles that I threw to Ed. But actually it's kind of relevant because I was quite biased against frameworks like Ember before I had a go. It's kind of one of those things where, I don't know, I think there's a bit of a thing going around in the JavaScript community of hyper-modularization. You guys have heard that term before? Like that concept that Substack talks about a lot, which is to break down your code into a lot of like little tiny modules that are very good at doing one specific task very well. And so when you come to creating a new project or doing a new thing, that you should go, oh, I need, I don't know, collection manipulation or something, I'll grab Lodash, or I need, you know, routing, I'll grab some specific framework just for routing, and then I'll like munge all of those together and create some ultimate hyper framework of all my favorite things. Which seems like a really good idea, but I think it's kind of become a bit of a problem because people kind of come to JavaScript and just go, oh, what do I do? I'm going to build an application now. Which amalgamation of crap should I like munch together to actually make an application? So there's kind of two sides to it there really. Like Ember is a framework that does everything for you, and hypermodularization is a framework where you have to do everything yourself. And so I really liked that hypermodularization thing, but then when I came into some companies that were doing Ember stuff, I kind of realized that frameworks like Ember actually give a lot of power to the developers and to the development team, despite them maybe having a bit of a lack of JavaScript experience amongst people, or varying JavaScript experience. People can come to the framework and start being productive, which I'll talk more about. So that's me when I started with Ember about 6 months ago, and just like throwing code around, doing stuff, hadn't really touched the framework much at all, and just like shipping features, which is cool, but a little terrifying because I definitely had no idea what I was doing. And I think, I don't know if you guys have read the article by Eric Clemens entitled JavaScript Fatigue, but this I think is really relevant to the whole topic of hypermodularization and all those kinds of things, so I'll talk about that. This is a quote from the article by Eric, and it's definitely worth reading just to get a kind of a perspective from some people who are like really tired and pissed off with JavaScript. I'll just quickly read it. Ultimately, the problem is that by choosing React and inherently JSX, you've unwittingly opted into a confusing nest of build tools, boilerplate, linters, time sinks to deal with before you even create anything. And that looks like I'm just having a rip on React, but actually I think it's kind of a problem in general with JavaScript. It's like you come to build a web application from the hypermodularization perspective, you nest a cluster of things together, and then you get a build tool like Gulp or Grunt or Broccoli or some other thing, and then you like add that in, and then you write 600 lines of like configuration code to build it together, and then you're like, wait, I need to require these modules from different places. Should I use Webpack? Should I use System.js? Should I use AMD? Like, and then you finally get that working, and you still haven't even written a feature for your code base. You haven't got your minimal viable product yet. You've just started basically. And the other problem I think with that approach is kind of what Eric says in his article is abstractions are necessary to reduce the cognitive load of how things work so you can focus on creating. And I've kind of seen that a few times with the hypermodularization approach. It's like there's so much cognitive load just to get the build tools going, the API for that, the concepts of like caching and modules and all that stuff, like just totally overloads you before you've even written code. And I think there's two layers to that. The build tool stuff is obviously too complicated, but I think trying to pull together a bunch of different things from different places to build a code base also increases the cognitive load, and I think Ember kind of helps you a lot with those issues. Just jump in if you have any questions, by the way, or arguments. So with Ember, there's a few different conventions. It's an MVC framework. I think a lot of the frameworks in the browser are kind of MV something, but like Ember is 100% MVC. It's got a router, a controller, a model, and a view, and they all work kind of how you'd expect those things to work. They're very traditional kind of conventions. It's got a thing called services, which is just another abstraction for solving problems. It's kind of like a singleton that you can use to collect together functionality or behavior and kind of put it in one place. It's got utilities galore. Basically, jQuery is baked into Ember. So if you want to do Ajax the traditional way, then you can do it with Ember's access to jQuery. It's got computer properties and all that kind of dynamic updating stuff. It's got components. So if you want to wrap your code into nice sort of custom HTML components that you can then just reuse page to page and also have them fairly isolated from each other, then those are there for you. And there's Ember data as well, which is kind of for grabbing data from your persistence layer and that kind of thing. And I feel like once I kind of understood, especially the way Ember deals with the router, the controller, and models, I kind of just woke up and was like, oh, I know Ember.js. I was writing features for a little bit, but then, you know how it is with any framework or thing you work with, once you understand the key concepts and the way that the framework kind of deals with them, you'll just know how Ember works. And at that point, it's productivity time, man. You're just gonna ship features like crazy, which I think is a good thing. A big part of lowering the fatigue is, I was talking about that build tool stuff. When you come to something like React and you decide, okay, I'm going to use JSX. JSX is compiled. What am I going to use to build my JSX? Maybe I'll use Grunt, maybe I'll use Gulp. Okay, time to write a config file. Cool, I've written my config file, now I can build the JSX templates. It just goes on and on. Ember CLI is like all the opinions and decisions made for you. It's kind of like, I liken it to Ruby on Rails asset pipeline and all those kinds of things. It's like, you just don't need to think about it anymore. They've solved a lot of the problems of compiling JavaScript, compiling templates, all that kind of stuff. So it's a framework for all the annoying stuff that comes with compiling JavaScript. And it lowers the fatigue compared to other frameworks and libraries. I'm trying to think if there really are any other frameworks that have such an opinionated set of build tools. I don't really think that there are. And there's been a lot of talk in the community why doesn't React have something really opinionated like this? Or I can't comment for the Angular community, but yeah, Ember CLI it makes life a lot easier. So Ember CLI is basically, it's broccoli. I don't know if you know what broccoli is, but it's an asset pipeline. So it can, you give it different kinds of transforms and it can compile those things for you and turn them into something that's a web app at the end of the day. And it's got support for handlebars, which is the template language that Ember uses. CSS preprocessors like less and Sass. It's also got a full testing framework with it, so you can just start writing tests for Ember straight away. And that framework has helpers for all the different conventions. I want to test a component or I want to test a controller or whatever. It's got all those things. If you want to write CoffeeScript or ES6, you just can, straight up. No config, just start running ES6. That, for me, was just a huge deal because that whole Babel thing, it's great, it works and stuff, but there's a lot of fluffing around. But Ember CLI it was just easy. You just start a new project and start running ES6 JavaScript, finally. It's a good feeling. Ember data is the persistence layer that I was talking about before. So Ember data is agnostic to your persistence mechanism, which basically means that you can swap in and out different kinds of adapters based on what kind of data you want to load. So it comes by default with a REST adapter for JSON. So you can turn this, it turns this store.findRecord call into a call to your RESTful endpoint to pull down some data and store it. Store it in memory for the time, and it just works for most use cases. It's solid. What can I say? I mean, I was building with a Rails backend, which this JSON endpoint thing was pretty much built for, but it does just feel like, yet again, just another one of those things where it's like, I just don't have to care about how I'm pulling data. It's all handled for you. And you basically define a bunch of models that sort of describe your data, and Ember kind of handles the rest of it. Oh, I'm kind of racing through this. Any questions? No? The other thing that I think is really important for a framework is that it should have a component story. Because I think everyone in the web community is like, oh, we've got to have components. We've just got to have them. And a lot of Ember's sort of recent work has been influenced and inspired by React and their approach to kind of isolated components and passing data down. So yeah, Ember has a really good story for components, and routable components are coming sometime in the current major version, which is really exciting, which basically just means you're going to be able to route to a full-blown component that does, that handles all your logic and have nested components inside it and that kind of thing. And I guess now's a good time to kind of mention that the Ember core team, probably one of my favorite things about Ember so far is that they've been working their asses off for backwards compatibility. They ship new features to the framework, but they do it all with private APIs and stuff, and they keep the public APIs as consistent as possible, and they minimize breaking changes, which is pretty important when you compare it to something like Angular, elephant in the room, where they're just like, yo, we need to rewrite. You guys are just going to have to wait, no idea when it's coming out, but good luck with that. I don't know, I think that's props to the Ember team that they've worked so hard on that. Ember routing. I don't know, routing is actually, there's not a lot of frameworks that do routing that well. Or there are frameworks that just or people call them frameworks like Knockout, for example. Where's the routing in Knockout? There's nothing in Knockout for routing. And the libraries that do it badly. And but Ember routing is really, really nice and really simple, and it works well. So it's one of the most powerful features of Ember because it's so simple and straightforward. The URL determines the state of your application as kind of the kind of RESTful approach. It's really familiar to Rails developers, which is why so many Rails developers seem to like Ember. But once you get your head around it, it's really nice. Here's just a basic example of setting up some routes and just nesting them inside each other. So this will just be post/new to create a post. And then Ember has this thing called model hooks for routing. So basically, I was going to go to the guide, but I might just briefly explain it. So your route determines the resource that you're loading. So if you have, for example, posts in your application, then you set up a route and you say, if you've got Ember data in there, which you probably do, you go away and you get some posts, and once they're finished loading via a promise, then your controller and your view have access to the posts and can do whatever they want with them. So it's just really simple, and it just kind of makes that cognitive load of thinking, get resource, display resource, just really simple. And then because it's nested, the routes are nested, once you've fetched your posts and you want to do something with something that belongs to posts, you'll already have access to that data in that controller if you want it. So you can pull down the models you've already loaded from the parent controllers and use them to display richer data or do more stuff. And it's just, I don't know, It's just so simple. So I think people make a few mistakes when trying to choose a framework, and I've definitely made several of these mistakes myself, probably all of them at some point. And I just wanted to kind of cover them because I feel like really the point of this talk is just to make you think about what your team needs, what's your business case, who are your customers, what does your development team need to be productive as well. Don't choose based on hype. That's really obvious, but like even if it's someone you really respect who's just said Ember is the best thing since sliced bread, like me, just because I'm telling you and hyping about Ember, it doesn't mean that it's the right decision for your team. You know what your product needs, you know what your people need to be productive. Use those as your decision, your key decision factors, not some guy at CHCH JavaScript said it was really good. Like, you're going to have to dig into it a little bit and have a look for yourself. Look at the key things that you need for your product and decide, does Ember make sense? And don't make decisions that take into account what you like or what feels right to you. Like, in most cases, you're going to be working with a team of other people. Like, I could go the hypermodularization approach, right? And I could go, oh yeah, like this just works for me. I love like functional programming right now, so I'm just going to pick up all those sweet functional language, libs and stuff, and just go crazy. And that feels right to me. But is that something that's going to help my team be productive? I'm not so sure. Like, they don't have any basic knowledge of functional programming. They're really familiar with MVC or some other thing. Like, let's think about what they need. Consider the weaknesses and strengths of your team, and consider how easy it would be for someone else to take it over if you leave. And I don't know, this one's kind of a favorite for me at the moment, is consider how fast you can go without encountering technical debt. Like, I don't know, I just was really amazed at how fast I could go with Ember, how fast I could ship like a significant piece of single page application, functionality that was really like rich and interactive, and the separations of concerns are there, ES6 is there, like what technical debt am I really encountering by taking that on? But on the flip side, consider your customer. Is poor mobile connection or minimal access to data or a slow device an issue for like your major customer base? Then maybe a big monolithic framework's not the right thing for you. Like Ember is probably, in that case, something you want to at least have a second thought about, because these frameworks are fast, but they're not like, as fast as you can go. And how fast do you need to be for your customer to actually have a good experience? Like that's worth thinking about. And I'm not talking about pre-optimizing or anything like that, like trying to like benchmark every line of code you write, but just thinking about, man, Ember's a lot of kilobytes to download. Is that going to be a problem for my customer? Just things like that. So if you're going to choose Ember, one of the things I would look at is the JavaScript experience of your team. Because one thing I've noticed over the past 6 months working with people of varying degrees of understanding of JavaScript is that all of them felt relatively comfortable writing Ember. And there's probably, a lot of them were coming from a Rails background, so that's probably a key contributing factor. Like, a lot of what Ember does feel inspired by Rails development. But yeah, JavaScript experience low, still shipping features. That seems good to me. The conventions are a huge help. I've talked about that enough. There's a really good community for Ember, and I mean, like any community, there's probably a few D-bags out there, but for the most part, there's a really good Slack channel where you can kind of just throw out a question and you may not get answered straight away, but in general, people really try to be helpful, and that's nice. It's got that kind of Ruby community feel to it, and like, love or hate Ruby, their community is probably one of the best programming communities of all the communities, just because they feel like they have this focus on support and encouragement in general. Not perfect, but definitely one of the better communities at kind of rallying together and helping each other do things. And yeah, at the end of the day, I think it's probably the most productive framework I've worked with, and I have worked with quite a few. So I feel like I have at least some perspective to say that. I've worked with Angular, which is weird and crazy to me. And definitely the abstractions in Ember, in Angular are there, but a lot of them are really confusing and don't make a lot of sense to someone coming with a traditional like MVC background or something else. I've worked with Knockout, which just is not a framework, it's just a library. And I've worked with React, which I like, but I do agree with that Eric Clemens article about the JavaScript fatigue thing. Like, if you're actually going to build like really large apps with React, there's a lot of decisions to make, and it's so bleeding edge at the. I think it's fair to say that it's fairly bleeding edge at the moment. Like, there's all these like sort of philosophies for building React programs, things like Redux and all these kinds of things, and it doesn't feel like anyone's quite settled on like a best approach to like building large React apps, and I think that's worth thinking about. And Ember is really opinionated, and I don't know. Sometimes it saves time and sometimes it takes time because you realise I can't solve the problem quite the way I want to because Ember has said specifically you can't have access to these kind of objects when you're inside this object, right? Like, it's really strict MVC. They've made sure that they do separate things out. But I kind of think that kind of thing is something that some JavaScript developers really need right now, and is an expression of that JavaScript fatigue article where people just really want someone to tell them how to do stuff. I cut myself a few times on Ember's bleeding edge, trying to like bring some balance to this because it does feel like I'm saying Ember's the best thing since sliced bread. It has been over the past 6 months, although it really is settling down in the last month or so, been moving really, really fast. They did get heavily influenced by React, which wasn't even that long ago, and so started to like bring some of those paradigms into it, which meant a lot of refactoring and a lot of rework to the framework. And at times, with a company that wanted to keep up with the latest version of Ember at every point of the development process, that was a little bit painful. The documentation is still catching up. There were lots of times where I'd like sort of try and Google or Stack Overflow for the right kind of Ember paradigm for solving a problem, and it would be like use an array controller or some other thing, and like these concepts have been deprecated, and so you've got to kind of be really careful and wade your way through that and make sure that you understand which parts are being deprecated, what's being moved away, and what the kind of new way to do things is. And I think that's what the Slack channel was really good for, because I could kind of sanity check myself, ask a question in there, and someone would be like, no, you're crazy, or yes, you're on the right track. So yeah, you do have to be a little bit careful. It's still moving fast, but honestly, the web just feels like that in general. It's pretty hard to keep up with. Ember CLI was both my source of the most pain and the most joy. Like, it works really well when it works, but there were a few times where it was always one version behind the latest version of Ember, and we needed some new feature from that, or like you just had to keep deleting your node modules all the time. Every time you'd update, it's just like delete everything and reinstall it. It was the only way to get it to work. So yeah, there was some pain there. Yeah, that's about it. Any questions? Cool.
You know what it is?
Yeah, go for it.
Does it have a TypeScript binding? Or you're not lover of TypeScript?
I have mixed feelings about TypeScript, but actually huge chunks of Ember are being, or of the latest features of Ember are actually being written in TypeScript, which is really interesting to me because I always thought of TypeScript as something that Microsoft developers were obsessed with, and I have a little bit of a default to ignoring anything that a Microsoft developer says, because they seem to just like, there seems to be a bit of a cargo culting as to the technology choices. A TypeScript binding, I don't actually know if Ember CLI handles TypeScript, but I don't see why it wouldn't. I mean, at the end of the day, it's an asset pipelines thing, right? So you can compile it down and then move on to the next step. So yeah, you could use TypeScript with it, I guess. If that's your question, you could totally use TypeScript with it, I'm sure there are people probably already doing it. I just haven't. Do you know it yet? No.
No, I can't say it's something that's commonly done. It's kind of like the Ember way is that we use ES6 in all of ES6, and like if you use ES6 and if you stick to like the well-paved path that everyone's walking down, we'll take care of you. But otherwise, you're back to making your own build process. It's definitely something you can do. Ember allows you to do pretty much anything. It's just they don't. You're off the well-worn path, basically. Yeah. What happens is now you're now back to where you're building your own framework a little bit.
One thing I didn't really talk about is that Ember CLI does a lot of auto-resolving. So if you were to write like a route and a controller, then it auto-resolves those in pairs with each other because a route always backs a controller in Ember. And so the auto-resolve is quite complicated. So it may be that you might run into some trouble with that if you were building TypeScript modules. I'm not really sure. But yeah.
Yeah, on the documentation thing as well, at work it's surprisingly common to just to Google search and then just limit the search results to the previous month or the previous 2 months, because otherwise you can run to stuff and you run to stuff from 2013, 2012, and it's I'm having trouble with this feature in Sprout Core.
Sprout Core,
which is the original name for Ember, and if it says Sprout Core, you just run. You just immediately close the tab and you go somewhere else for help.
Cool. No more questions? Oh, a question.
If your employer were not forcing you to use Ember, would you use Ember?
That's funny because he's my employer. Yeah, I think definitely if I'm working with a larger team, I'd be quite happy to use Ember. I was thinking about it today whether if I was going to build a small project at home and pick up Ember, whether I'd do it. For my own personal projects, I don't really think so, because I'm not really sure why. It just feels like there's still a lot of other things in the JavaScript land that I'd like to learn. Things I'd like to try and see if I like them, because I know solidly where I stand with Ember now, and it is a good framework. But I think that will be my only hesitation, is just that I know what it does and how it does it. I don't think I'd want to use it until I've tried every JavaScript framework, and we all know that's like a timeline that we're never going to meet.
So what's your next framework?
What's my next framework?
Say until you try every framework.
Oh, right, yeah. Well, I guess if I was going to talk about something I'm playing with, I really do like React in some ways. And I know that everyone's really hyped about React and stuff. I like JSX, and I know a lot of people hate it. That's the templating language that React uses. And I've kind of been thinking a few times lately, if I was building just a small, maybe a website for someone, I could imagine replacing jQuery in all those projects with React instead. And the reason for that is that it's components, it's just simple way to break up your code into little reusable plugins, basically, which is what jQuery does. But it's so hard to keep your jQuery nice and organized. But it's so easy to throw together a few React components and then just reuse them over and over in your project. So
yeah, I think we definitely have the same feeling around Ember at our team as well. Ember's kind of a force multiplier for teams, because it has so many opinions, because it works really strictly, and really, really, a really huge one is because they maintain backwards compatibility. If we build something for our clients, it better work in 5 years' time. And that's not a time scale I have to face when I'm working by myself or when I'm working on smaller projects. But when I need to come back to this and fix it, or add a feature or hand it off to someone else, or work across completely different projects that all do completely different things, it's really powerful to have that structure and those opinions in place.
It's JavaScript for enterprise. Yeah.
So which opinions got in your way?
What's that, sorry?
Which opinions have got in your way?
Which opinions about Ember, or
Ember's opinions? You're saying it's opinionated?
Sure. Yeah. Trying to think. It's always hard to think of a really specific example, but it's probably been, in general, the isolation of the router from the controller. So, or actually specifically that routing parameters always come through a route. And once the routing parameters are sitting in the route object, they don't go anywhere else unless you send them somewhere else. So sometimes I found it really painful, because parameters are useful in a URL for filtering collections, or figuring out where you want to go next, or I don't know. They're just kind of this hacky, easy way to do something in your application. But Ember's really strict about it. The the parameter hits the router and that's where it stays. And you could pass it along with the model. You know, you could pass along a few params that you got, but that just feels horribly hacky when you do it, and you feel like you're doing a very bad thing. So, yeah, I guess that was more in the cases where I'd sort of pick something up and someone was like, add a feature to some code we've already written, and I know that if I could just get hold of the parameter, you know, it'd be a quick fix. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the first stumbling block we had was promises everywhere all the time. It's really fantastic. As soon as you get used to it, you're like, wow, this is amazing. And especially Ember tries to make it as transparent as possible. Like every single value on an Ember page, it always renders the latest value, no matter what that is. Just really, really nice.
Yeah.
But there's some crazy data query stumbling blocks when you're like chaining promises and like playing with closures and yeah.
It also feels like a general JavaScript problem. Promises.
Do you think that'll simplify with the 7 async away?
Yes, it will. Like, it totally will.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some discussion, right? Because the async await features are quite imperative, whereas like the promises are much more functional style of composing things.
Yeah. I mean, async await backs up the promises, right?
Yes, it backs us up
Yes.
for promises, and therefore it just totally will make it more simple. If you, that's the thing. Sometimes in Ember, like you're not going to be loading one model; you're going to be loading several, and so you're going to have several chain promises. And if you had async await, yes, it'll be so much simpler. Get a thing, get another thing, get another thing, job done.
Yeah, at least we'll know they adopt it because they've already adopted ES6 so well. Like, had
Yes.
it the whole time, we never even thought about it. You just use it.
That's probably one of my favorite things so far. Yeah, it's just feeling right. It's okay to use ES6. It's all right. And on what was my other opinion that was really blocking was crap. It's gone. I'll think about it in a minute. But yeah, any more questions?
Were the opinions kind of a problem for new members in the team? I remember when I started first time, it was like 4 years ago, or 9 version, I used Ember, and I was thrown into a project, and I had I was coming from Java, so I was expecting everything that happens like C in the code that has to happen, but here it's like you have to write something at the end of your file name, and then Ember does some magic, and that's, you know, if you're used to like Java, it's very like what's happening and how do you like teach the team like look through this like cheat sheet. This is what Ember does, and then you understand the code.
All the Rails developers were super happy with it because Rails is just black magic from end to end. Like, I just when I'm running Rails code, I assume that it doesn't make sense, but something good is happening to me while I'm running. But the people that had a real problem with it were all the ones who'd come from my approach, which was like the hyper modularization. Like, if I'm not requiring it with AMD, how is the file here? You know, that kind of stuff. So, and those people just like needed some talking down from the Rails developers. Like, it's okay. What's happening is good. You know, just move on. And yeah, well, that was my experience with it. Was just that Rails developers loved it, and people coming from JavaScript hated it for a while, and then just it wasn't so much their own personal experience of Ember that made them like it or continue with it, but it was more they were just seeing that like everyone from the Rails background was doing really well with it and building features with it. I think kind of made people more positive. And also in this with this particular client, I really liked that they were like, we're using Ember. We don't give a crap what you think about the fact that we're using Ember. But to the new employees and existing employees, they were just like, this is the technical decision we've made based on a bunch of like really relevant factors. Deal with it and carry on. And once people did kind of get over their biases, myself included, like it was a pretty happy experience running code with it. So yeah, but I don't know if you're coming from a Java background. I don't know. Coming from, I've worked with various backend languages, but yeah, like coming from those languages to Rails, because I just started working with Rails this year, was like a really similar experience. Like it's extremely painful at first, and there's a lot of the time that you just don't know really what's happening or how. I don't know. It's just magic, and you just, yeah, you know, you Google it a bit and you start saying, oh, okay, it's just like requiring a bunch of, you know, Ruby files in the background, or it's doing some magic, and then you just move on. And then maybe later you might understand it, but it's not important that you understand it right now. But yeah, you might understand the rainbow.
Is the magic reliable?
Yep.
So when the magic doesn't work, can you figure it out?
Sure. Yeah. Probably with Ember, the biggest struggle I've had with magic is the testing element. Like, the testing framework is good, and once I kind of got up and running with it, it was good. But the testing framework's all wrapped up in Ember CLI, which, as I mentioned before, has its own resolver, its own way of kind of like making sure that the correct JavaScript modules are available to you when you're testing and stuff. So there were a few times I really struggled with the magic when it came to testing, because it just felt like I wanted to, like, in my previous JavaScript testing experience, it's just been like, delve into the object, who cares if it's, you know, there is no private in JavaScript, just like get in there and figure out what stuff does. And
I guess it's very similar to any problem where you have got the choice of everything is implicit and everything is explicit. When everything is explicit, you need to write more verbose code, but you understand, and then everybody understands, because if it does match your thinking or your intent, the code explains that. But if it's implicit, and it's all good when your intent matches the implicit intent, but when it goes to the different directions, you start like, it doesn't make sense. Like, I would better have it written now.
yeah,
So,
yeah, no, definitely. And I think, especially when you're testing an abstraction, like in any different framework, like you're testing controllers, you're testing models or whatever, like there's a lot of setup that goes into actually grabbing an object like that, putting it into some sort of like sane environment, and then testing it, right?
Well,
like
also the isolation.
No, that's what I mean.
So,
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm getting at. Like a Rails controller, it's not just a plain old object. And same with an Ember controller. Like, there's a whole bunch of app setup code and magic that happens to actually make it feel like a controller when you're running code with it. And so you really do need that when it comes to Ember, because if you were just testing a plain old object, it would be kind of insane, and you wouldn't really know if you were actually testing what you wanted to test. Because then when you put it into a real environment, it would behave completely differently. So the magic is kind of necessary.
I think the big magic that you'll hit pretty fast is that when you get debugging, you're like, oh, this is in the run loop, and you just get this enormous call stack, and it's just like all nonsense except for like maybe one thing if you're lucky. That's your code.
That's a really good point.
It's like
Actually,
miles of nonsense, and then like sometimes your code just isn't in there, and it's just miles of nonsense.
This guy loves Ember.
Oh yeah, we work it every day. But yeah, and so that gets people to begin with, but it gets easy to work through. And then the second one is like, Ember is like looks at JavaScript objects with kind of like pity. They like come from the Ruby world and they're like, object isn't very good, let's make an Ember object. And so there's an Ember object and you base everything on that. And it gives you all these methods that you need to actually get stuff done. But like when you first start, you're like, why isn't this just a normal JavaScript object? Like, why did you have to wrap this? And then like you get a month and you're like, that's why you wrap it, because JavaScript objects don't work like for those like, at all. So you have to learn the Ember objects, but it's definitely worth it.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Cool.
Cheers.
Okay.